Welcome to the Section Skills Seminar. We're going to be talking about roles of players within a section today. So Hayato and I have recorded some demonstrations that you're going to hear throughout this seminar, and we're going to be discussing many of the hidden issues that surround various things in orchestra sections. A lot of this applies to chamber groups like brass quintets. Certainly a lot of it applies to bands too. But for the most part, we're going to be addressing it from sort of the orchestral point of view, just because that's what we do, and that's also the type of music that we're going to be using for demonstrations. So for 70 people on stage to communicate a single artistic vision to an audience, so many things have to happen. So, as you know, the music has to be clearly written by the composer. All the musicians on stage must be proficient in their physical ability to play the instruments. And everyone needs to be an artist as well. The better all of those components are, the better the orchestra will sound, and the better they'll be at communicating well to the audience. However, I would say that the overall caliber of an orchestra is ultimately determined by how well their artistic chain of command is working. So this is the artistic chain of command here. So it's sort of a hierarchy, I guess you could say. You can have the greatest conductor in the world and the greatest musicians in the world, but if they don't communicate clearly, or if their lines of communication are a total free-for-all, things are not going to work well. The conductor needs to have clear channels of communication with all principals in the orchestra, and then those principals need to be great at interpreting what that conductor really wants. Sometimes it's clearer than other times. And they need to also be great at communicating, mostly non-verbally, this vision to their respective sections. And then the members of those sections have to be really great at receiving this vision and following it exactly, even though, again, most of the information that the people in the section are given is nonverbal information. So there's a lot of nuance involved, but this is the basic structure that allows things to work. And now we're going to explore some of the various roles in the section.
Well, I guess for me, though, it's not so much about cueing, but like breathing together, because if I move my horn too much, I miss notes. It's, yeah, it gets obnoxious, so I try to just breathe and move a certain way.
And I find that from a follower perspective, like when you're like thinking at me,
Yeah.
you don't really have to move very much. Like I can just pick up on what you're doing.
Right.
It's harder
Yeah.
with distance, like here.
Yeah.
But in normal life, the smallest of signals, as long as they're connected with your mind,
Right.
to me and the rest of the section.
Right. Yeah. Everyone needs to be on the same page. We're
We're going to be talking about roles in the section, and we're going to start out with talking about what the principal does. So in the trumpet section, for example, in our trumpet section, Hayato has worked with so many conductors all over the world and has a general sense of what most of them are going to want style-wise for any given piece. So this is in terms of what kind of articulation they might want, what sort of character they might want, little stylistic nuances and things like that. There are standard approaches to different genres and styles, and for most orchestral music, you can develop a pretty good frame of acceptable style. So you can have your default approach to a certain piece of music that's, comes collectively from all the recordings you've listened to over time and from maybe many other performances you've had in the past with different conductors. But of course, the principal of the section, in our case Hayato, is especially tuned in to what the conductor is asking for. So he's ready to make any subtle adjustments as they're communicated to him, and then he passes it on to me. So we're going to start out with the standard of orchestral standards, which is Beethoven. Anyone or any orchestra who can pull off Beethoven really well can find their way to doing almost anything well in the orchestra. It's sort of the baseline standard. As you're listening to these next excerpts, notice the subtle cues that Hayato is giving me, how he cues the opening, how he communicates tempo, note lengths, phrase direction, and dynamic changes. It's a little bit challenging because we're having to sit so far apart due to the current conditions, but nevertheless, there's still subtlety to it, and you may notice me having to look over quite a bit more than in real life when we're closer together. But this is to see those little cues that he's giving. So see if you can tell what he's doing. We're going to play something from Beethoven 5, second movement, and then we're going to play the fourth movement of Beethoven 5. I think part of it is you have to think so strongly the vision that you want, right? So that you can communicate to us.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough balance of like preparing on my own, having my own ideal way of how things go, how conductor wants it to go, how everybody else is playing that moment, and then I have to adjust accordingly, so. Well, I guess, yeah, it starts with my own prep of listening to recordings and find what the common denominator is. And, yeah, I try to pick a reputable orchestra, not like some random Naxos recordings, So, yeah, that's how I get a general sense of how things go. Even a piece I've played before, there's always something I can listen to. And yeah, going over with score my part, and sometimes I realize, oh yeah, maybe that's how Beethoven intended, or that's how this conductor wanted, all the reason behind it. So I'm not just blindly following at the rehearsal and just having my own voice made up. And yeah, and then again, just being consistent so I can always tell the same way so you can follow. Hopefully everything's clear.
Almost every young player at one point takes a look at their first Beethoven part and they say, "Oh, that'll be easy." So they cast it aside, but it's so much more deadly than almost anything else you can play.
It's like, same note length, same note can mean a million different things, and yeah, you have to know exactly what that means.
Yeah, I think the communication aspect of it is so much more demanding than almost any other music.
Yeah.
And it sounds it's very obvious, like when it's not on. It's really easy to sound bad on Beethoven.
All the style choices, rhythmical. It's not, like a lot of times conductor would want something totally different than what you used to. Like, especially tempo for Beethoven. Then in that moment, how you play changes, and then just being on top of it and being clear about how I'm going to change it.
Another part of a principal player's job is to provide the pitch center stability for the section. Intonation can be tricky in the orchestra. When we start out, as younger players, we're often told to build from the bottom with regard to tuning. And that's a great way to start out learning about tuning, but in the orchestra, we're trying to follow our section principals, who are almost always on the highest part, and they're often not even playing the root of the chord. As we discussed in the artistic chain of command, or the hierarchy before, the principal's job is to be fully committed to the pitch center of the other orchestra section principals. So almost kind of like having a tuning drone running through everyone's heads collectively. And as weird as it sounds, this is communicated to the section, and we're all in agreement. So to show an example of this, here's an excerpt from Brahms' Academic Festival Overture, the Trumpet Chorale. And you'll notice that Hayato in this excerpt rarely has the root of the chord. Occasionally he does, but typically he doesn't. But he's still firmly committed to one pitch center that's running through his head. And he doesn't try to adjust to me at all, because then it gets crazy if we're both trying to adjust to each other. Instead, he provides a super clear pitch center that I can quickly adjust to. It's the job of the section players to make the intonation great, and the principal player helps make that happen by providing that stability. So here's Academic Festival. The section player's job, especially the second player, but really any section player, your job is to get in the head of your principal player. You want to follow every bit of information they're giving you, again, often non-verbally, as it has to be. Tempo, dynamics, style, phrasing, note lengths, etc., all sorts of things. You want to sort of live in their head, think through them, as strange as that sounds. It's what you have to do. And you want to pay very close attention to what they're doing, again, especially with like note lengths and style, and match them exactly as though like you're the same person playing two different parts. So we're going to play two different excerpts to sort of demonstrate this. We're going to play something from Dvorak 9, where we're not playing octaves or unisons or anything. We're just going to play as a section. But again, it's my job in this case to follow exactly what he's doing.
This one has the slight rubato, obviously like a big cadence there, so yeah, it depends on what conductor wants, and sometimes people don't even take time, sometimes has a big grand gesture there, so I have to be aware of that potentially happening, and when it happens, I need to be clear and not get in my own way, not everyone else's way, just a matter of timing and being consistent.
In a way, you're sort of a follower to the conductor.
Yeah, I'm glued. At that point, I'm not even looking at music.
The next role of the section player that we're going to be exploring is following rhythmically. So a section player has to be on the principal's rhythmic grid. We talk about that a lot in chamber music as well, that everyone has to share a collective rhythmic grid. Like, in other words, it's not enough just to subdivide yourself, though that's very important too. But everyone has to feel the same subdivision together. And that's something you can definitely do with practice. And every orchestra section really needs it. And you want to be on the principal's rhythmic grid. So you have to be completely in their head to make sure you're right there with them. And it also helps you to follow nuances of style and phrasing too. So we're going to play a couple of things to demonstrate this. We're going to play something from Debussy's Fetes and something from Don Quixote. next role of section players we're going to talk about here is unison playing. That seems like that's not so much of a section concern because you're playing unison, you have the same line. But it's actually a huge issue that can either go wonderfully or terribly, sort of depending on how it's prepared. When playing unison lines with a principal player, you have to shadow a little bit while still mirroring every choice the principal makes. If you dominate like you're the only one on the part, you're going to cripple the principal, and the whole thing just comes across as sloppy and rough and not pleasant to listen to. If you're shadowing so much that you're just sort of transparent, the principal gets weirdly weighed down by it. You have to find that sweet spot where you're contributing to that unique section unison sound that the composer wanted, while still following effectively and helping to sort of energize the line. So to demonstrate this, we're going to play one of my favorite unison excerpts, which is Dvorak 8, and there are parts of it that are not in unison, but the bulk of it is. And so what I'm trying to do here, as we're playing it together, is to just fit into that sound, give it some extra energy, but not weigh it down at all. I'm sort of like contributing into it rather than trying to dominate in any way. So this is Dvorak 8. It's time to talk about one of the most critical skills for a second player, and again, this applies to all sort of section players at various points. When playing octaves, the second player in the section needs to boost up the first player. If the lower octave is weak or detached, or someone's kind of hiding on it, the first player is totally weighed down by it. They're going to get tired quicker, their sound won't project as much, and it's not as enjoyable to listen to. But if the second player digs in with the right kind of weight and thinks about boosting up the higher octave, it results in this fantastic, powerful sound. And it makes the first player sound amazing. So think about when you're jumping on a trampoline with a friend, like a really big trampoline, and you do one of those, I think they're called double jumps, where you sort of land on it and dig in just the right way with the right kind of timing, and it sends your friend flying up with a boost of energy. It's just like that, except without the trampoline. You can do this with your approach to lower octaves, and it's great for loud, powerful playing. Obviously, it can really, really sound awesome. But having a great lower octave is just as effective with very soft passages too. The way that you contribute to that lower octave makes or breaks your first player a lot of times, especially in the really soft stuff. I think if you give them sort of a really stable foundation, it makes everything just go a lot better, and it's more fun to play. So this next excerpt is a great example of unison versus octaves. Since we were just talking about unisons, this is from Dvorak 9. It starts out as a unison, both of us, so we're going to go back to what we talked about a minute ago with the sort of shadowing but still contributing. And then we break into octaves, and the second player has to really almost play like twice as loud when you get to that part. But not just like loud, trying to be really, loud and crass and heavy. That's not going to help. It has to just be like weighted in the right way. That like what we were discussing a second ago, like really digging in and sort of thinking about boosting up that higher octave, and that's going to make whoever's playing it feel a lot better, and it's just going to sound really awesome. So this is Dvorak 9. principle, we're going to talk about leading through rubato. So there are countless examples of orchestra pieces that have a lot of push and pull with the time. A skilled conductor can communicate this pretty well to section principals, and then the principals have to be able to communicate this with their sections. The first step is to have a crystal clear map of how you want it to sound in your head. That's easier said than done. To have a really, really clear sort of vision, the oral equivalent of a vision in your head that's totally detailed is sort of difficult to find at first. It takes a lot of listening and a lot of just kind of thinking about it and conceptualizing what you want. So the next step is to use your mind and subtle body language to show this to your section. It's really thinking it. You do a lot of subtle body language that you often don't realize you do when you really know something. And so when you're very clear in your head, you're going to be pretty clear with subtlety and body language too. Thinking as a team really helps to achieve this goal of a cohesive, unified section through rubato. So it's, again, that sort of group mind idea. We're going to demonstrate this with Capriccio Espagnole. It's sort of almost like a cadenza sort of sound to it that has a whole lot of push and pull, as you'll hear.
It's a unison solo almost, like the brass section is playing this thing together. So I might have a freedom, I don't, you know what I mean? So my goal is to hopefully be the leading voice and everyone hopefully agrees with me. And yeah, a lot of times that one conductor would just give a cue and things happen. And once it starts grooving, he might do something. But the past times I played, they don't do anything. Like, they never did anything. So I let it fine, I guess. I hope. So.
On the same topic of rubato, we're going to talk about the section end of this, which is following through rubato. As much as a great principal can do to lead clearly, it's really up to the section players to follow with commitment. Follow fully. It helps to be in the head of the principal, as we talked about. You really, really want to think through their heads as much as you can. And you have to be in on the storytelling. It's not just the principal player telling a story and you're kind of tagging along. You both have to tell the story together. And you both have to play the same character in the story with the same commitment. Whether you're literally thinking of a storyline with what you're playing, or you're just sort of showing either a character or a mood, or sort of just general like emotion and style of a phrase, you both have to be that same character, and you have to be fully committed to being that character together. Hayato once said to me that it's sort of like this whole leading and following in rubato. It's like watching a pair of great dancers. Yes, one leads and one follows, but they both have to be into it and fully committed to what they're doing. Otherwise, it's going to look super strange. So to demonstrate this, we're going to play something from Mahler 1. This is from the third movement of Mahler 1. And there's quite a bit of push and pull, not in a cadenza sort of sense like the last excerpt, but it's fairly loose, and it's tough sometimes to follow exactly what the conductor wants as far as the push and pull. But even if you really know that, it's kind of hard to get it together. So it really is a group mind exercise for the first and second player together. So this is Mahler 1. Another very important skill for section players: know when it's your turn to lead and lead with authority. Even though you're a section player and you've been, bred to follow and to be fully committed to what someone else is sort of dictating to you, sometimes you're the leader. It actually happens a fair amount of time. If you think about it, uh, any section brass player in the orchestra is a solo voice. You're not sharing a part with anyone. You've got your own voice, and that's a sort of an important voice, even if you're playing while the principal's playing. But sometimes you're playing when they're not playing, and you have to know when it's your turn to really be the leader. For example, from the second chair, sometimes the principal player drops out. Like they don't have a part there, and I have to lead the third player, and I really have to like switch gears very quickly sometimes to know, okay, Hayato doesn't lead this entrance, I have to lead it, and I have to almost feel like I'm sitting in the principal chair for those measures. Um, and then, of course, there are times when you have a literal solo voice where you're the only one in the section playing and it's a prominent part. And when that happens, you have to take the reins without hesitation. You have to command the section and completely step into that role with no transition period at all. You're going from following to immediately leading with a great voice. So, and then of course you have to know when to pass the torch back to the principal and make that transition seamless. You don't want to continue to dominate once they come back in. So really, it's a very quick transition. And one of the best examples of this that I could think of is Bartok Concerto for Orchestra, which we did the second movement earlier, for the ideal game of pairs, following situation. But in the first and fifth movements, there are fugal passages that actually begin with the second trumpet in the section. The second trumpet plays it first. And those are moments where you really have to just take the reins and go. And then when the first player comes in, then you become a follower again, while maintaining a very prominent voice in this fugal texture. So again, one of my most favorite pieces ever, especially for a second player, Bartok Concerto for Orchestra. Another role of section players is that of other principal. Most large orchestras have assistant principal brass players who fill section positions but also regularly jump into the principal role. For example, with most trumpet sections that have an assistant principal trumpet, that person is the third trumpet player. So for pieces that have three trumpets or more, they're playing the third trumpet part, but then they're also regularly jumping into that principal chair. For example, if maybe there's a really heavy piece on the second half of a program, that assistant principal might play principal on the concerto on the first half to give the main principal a break. So in that case, it's like they're just filling that role of principal while the other principal's not on stage. But then sometimes you'll have composers who will write for split sections, so you actually have two principals on stage at the same time. Some examples of that are Berlioz, Dukas, Tchaikovsky, and some others, where they'll write 2 trumpet parts and 2 cornet parts. Others would sometimes write for 2 different keyed trumpet sections with 2 different keyed trumpets. So, for example, Strauss's Ein Heldenleben has 3 trumpet parts and 2 E-flat trumpet parts. And the first player of each section is a principal, but they also work together because they're on stage at the same time. And whoever the normal principal of that section is still maintains that place in the artistic hierarchy for the most part, the chain of command. So we're going to play something from Strauss's Ein Heldenleben, and Hayato is going to play the first B-flat trumpet part, and I'm going to play the first E-flat trumpet part. Now, for most of the piece, they're kind of doing their own things for the most part. Like, there's a really cool moment when the B-flat trumpet section goes off stage, and they play this really exciting fanfare, and the E-flat players have this cool stuff that they do during the battle scene. But this is a moment when the two come together, and they have this intertwining melodic stuff that they're doing, and it sort of just shows 2 different principal players playing together. So this is Strauss's Ein Heldenleben. There are some occasions when the first part is clearly a solo voice with the section accompanying it. Bach's music did this frequently. Here's an example of a piece that weaves back and forth between a full section voice and a solo voice that's supported by the rest of the section. So, as we sort of talked about before, that you need to know as a section player when it's time to lead and when it's time to follow, you'll see a little bit of this going on here too. When Hayato is sort of part of the section, he's leading, and then when he breaks off into his solo voice, there are a couple of little occasions when the second player has to lead the third player, who of course you're not hearing in this case. But you sort of have to lead the rest of the section temporarily until that solo voice comes back to join us. So this is something from Bach, Magnificat. We're going to play another piccolo excerpt here in a second. This is another example of a piece that has fugal textures or other layering when each voice should rise out of the texture and then make room for others to do the same. You see this sort of thing with many other pieces. The Bartok that we played earlier is an example of that. But you want to be on the lookout for texture like this and make sure that you're supporting all the other voices when they need to sort of pop out of that texture and be heard. So this is something from Bach, B minor Mass.
Yeah, Bach stuff. All his pieces are almost mathematical, so there's not too much wiggle room, even though I'm solo voice. It just needs to have the brilliance, the right style, and everything kind of fits in together automatically. automatically, you know. So.
In closing here, there's so much involved in the intricacies of section playing. Great leadership skills and great following skills take time to develop, and they're absolutely critical to raising your caliber of playing. The best ways to work on these skills are to listen intently and often, videos when you can, and live and up close anytime you have the opportunity. That's the very best thing you can do. You can play section excerpts or even just duets with friends as often as possible. Duet playing is unbelievably helpful for leading and following. You can record duets or excerpts by yourself, like a video recording of yourself playing one part, and then play back the other part with your video. And you'll be amazed by what you discover about the ways that you lead, and then the ways that you follow when the leader can't adjust to you also. And then, of course, the very best way sometimes is on-the-job training. So in your ensembles, whether it's band or orchestra, brass quintet, anything, have a constant awareness about when to lead, when to follow, and how to do both effectively.